Hi, everyone. It's Edwin Rutsch, Director of the Center for Building a Culture of Empathy, and I'm here with Stefanie Neubrand. Thanks, Stefanie, for joining me for this discussion.
Thank you, Edwin. Thank you very much.
Yes, I just wanted to introduce you. You just did your PhD thesis, so I guess that was last year, on the topic of the missing construct, empathy, conceptualization, operationalization, and the clinical considerations. So that was your PhD thesis. And then you also recently wrote an article, The Missing Construct, Empathy. And for anyone that's watching this that is not familiar with the term, you could say self-empathy too. It's kind of similar. We'll go into more depth about that. And that you're working, I believe, as a therapist now. Is that correct?
Both, right. I'm a researcher on the one hand, and I've been also working as a clinical psychologist as well.
Okay, so you do research then at the university. What university is that?
That was or is the University of Basel in Switzerland. Exactly, that's where I did my PhD. And I'm working in psychosomatics, but also in my own private practice.
And also, let me just real quick here. Somebody's trying to get in. I'm gonna meeting. And and also you're a musician, right? Is that correct? No, I thought you did some.
Great.
Are you doing music?
But, not really.
Oh, okay, then I was wrong about that. So,
although I love music, so that's fine.
Okay, great. Well, okay, so I got into, I saw your paper, Empathy.
Yes.
So it's about, we could say, like I was saying, self-empathy, and I'm working on a course, developing a course on defining empathy, and
Yes.
self-empathy is one component of it. So when I saw your paper, I thought, oh, great, let's really talk about this, what you're calling empathy, and kind of dig into that and just go through your paper, sort of step by step. But before we jump into it, maybe you could just share, like, how did you get interested in this topic to begin with?
Yeah, of course. Well, I think it's about almost 12 years ago that I've been an intern actually in the clinic I've worked for the last couple of years. And I was looking for a master's theme in the end. And I was sitting in this group sessions and I was observing like the patients in the clinic. And what I realized is that when people empathized with others, it seemed to be pretty, well, let's not say easy, but easier to feel into somebody else than then when they were asked questions themselves, feeling into themselves. So this struck me, this maybe pretty obvious observation. And I was then going into the literature of self-compassion. And the research on self-compassion is still new, but widely developing. And so I was reading a lot about self-compassion and empathy as well. And what struck me then was that a lot of researchers say that empathy is a capacity which can lead to compassion. So I was wondering, what then is the capacity of human beings to develop self-compassion? And I was looking into traditional psychological research, and I actually didn't find anything about what you call self-empathy or the capacity that may elicit self-compassion. So I was wondering if there's a missing construct, which I call it now. And I was talking to my professor at that time, and I told him about my observation, and he said, like, well, let's get into this, and you do your research on that topic. And so I started with research on empathy, actually, when I was doing my master's degree at university. And since then, I did research like for now more than 10 years. After I finished my master's degree, I actually wanted to work as a clinical psychologist. But my professor back then asked me if I would like to do a PhD on empathy. So I started my PhD on empathy then, and till then I did some research on empathy. Yes.
Oh, great. Yeah, so you've been working at this for quite some time then. So you've really done a deep dive
Exactly.
on the topic then. That is, I've been working on this for about 15 years. So it sounds like
Perfect.
that's about how long you've been doing it too.
Yeah,
Yeah.
great. Exactly.
Yeah, so I guess my first question is why, that's interesting how you got started with it, but why are you going with empathy, which is IMPATHY versus self-empathy? How did you kind of coin this new term versus going with, because there is a bit of literature, on self-empathy already, but.
Yeah, back then when I was starting with my research on empathy, first of all, the term refers to empathy. That means the conceptualization of empathy is grounded in insights of empathy research and is associated with the perspective of the phenomenal I. So the first person perspective. And this introversive empathy, you could say, is coined for me as a term empathy. So it's actually a quite a phenomenal human capacity that you can build a first perspective I. And more than 100 years ago in psychological research, this separation was made between the I, the self as subject, and the me as the self as object. Maybe also as a self as subject you can feel into, but let's say the self as subject and the self as object. So we need this perspective of I, the first person perspective, to feel into ourselves. Because the question is, how can we be our own empathic counterpart? Now, you're right that there are people calling it self-empathy. But well, if you go into contemporary theories about the self, which is quite a dissonant discourse, people would say that the self is an abstract construction. It is not something that is experiencing itself or which can be experienced directly. What, however, can be experienced is your relation to the self, your abstract representation of what a self might be. So the idea of empathy is that you have this perspective, I, the first person perspective, which enables a human being to feel themselves into themselves, to become an empathic agent in their own right.
Okay, so the I is sort of that part that is doing the observation of the self then? Is that
It is experiencing,
uh
yes,
okay, it's
exactly.
doing the experiencing because I can sense into my feelings, I can sense into the
Exactly.
feelings in here, and you're using the I as the sort of the observer
Yes, you could
of
say
that.
the I feels into the me, and the me can be like
Oh.
any kind of experiences you're having in the present moment. Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
any bodily experiences, any emotional experiences you're having. So the I feels into the me, because the question is, which is quite intriguing, I think, how can a person be empathic with themselves? Like, how can you become your own counterpart? So with the phenomenal perspective, the first person perspective, you're understanding that you're within a inner plurality in which you can act and you can experience yourself. So you can, how can you say, develop a greater understanding of yourself and your multiplicity.
Okay. Oh, that yeah, I see that. So in terms of the definition, how are you sort of defining empathy? I mean, you sort of been touching on that, but do you have a kind of a deeper kind of definition, foundational definition? I mean, you had said in from your writing here, empathy can be considered as an inwardly directed empathy was sort of the starting point.
Yes, exactly. So maybe a short definition would be that empathy is the capacity to share in and understand your own experiences. So, and what you can see there is that it grounds on a lot of on empathy research, because there are researchers saying that empathy, that means empathizing with another person, is sharing in and understanding the experiences of another person. So empathy, if you turn it around, means sharing in and understanding your own experiences and situation in the end. Exactly.
Okay. Yeah, it's great. So it was the other part you'd mentioned phenomena or phenomenology. So that's kind of like the philosophical sort of foundation.
Yes.
So, it's come up in the kind of the work that I've been doing. So the more European phenomenological view versus maybe the American or British sort of, I don't know, what's the philosophy there? It's sort of dualistic, maybe, or of a dualistic sort of a philosophy. Do you have any sort of thoughts about those views, those different
Yeah.
philosophical foundations? Because I think like people like Carl Rogers, Dan Zahavi, and so forth have been more in the phenomenological, and they don't see so much this distinction of, I think, of feelings and cognitive. There's this here in America, it's like you define empathy as a cognitive or a feeling. And I see that as a problem, but I see that sort of goes to deeper sort of philosophical foundations.
Probably does. So intriguing aspect you're talking about. And actually, within my years of research, and especially my research for my PhD, I was reading the dissertation of Edith Stein. I don't know if you know her.
Sure, of course.
She's a disciple. She has been a disciple of Husserl, and that's the phenomenal philosophy. And more than 100 years ago, empathy was called Einfühlung, a German word. So it means, if you translate it, feeling into. That's why I often use these words to describe empathy or empathy, meaning like feeling yourself into yourself or into somebody else. And Edith Stein back then already wrote about the human capacity to feel yourself into a past I or a future I or a fantasized I. So what she was describing, and actually she was using these descriptions to explain empathy, empathizing with another. And so she was already referring with the term Einfühlung to empathy, to feeling yourself into yourself, that it is possible. Because first of all, we need to ask ourselves, is it possible? As the researcher, you asked this question. And that was actually my PhD about, to also look into this capacity. Is it actually a human capacity? And still be critical about it. And also with my research, please, everything I say, it's just like at the beginning, at the very first stage of research on empathy. So these philosophical aspects are really, really interesting. And we lost a lot of these insights when we used the term empathy. So what happened is, like, we had this term Einfühlung, Einfühlungsvermögen, which is also sort of a hint that it's a capacity, it's something we can learn, it's a skill. And people tried to find a translation for an English expression, and they used empatheia, and that went into empathy. You probably know that. So if we go back to all these origins of empathy, we date back to the term Einfühlung, which gives us lots of hints and insights about what this capacity might be. And actually back then, the understanding was broader than today, like Stein also including empathy, introversive empathy as well.
Yeah, so there's that empathizing. It's not just empathizing with someone else, but you can empathize with yourself.
Yes.
Empathize, you're sort of feeling into yourself in the past, like sort of your memories, and feeling into that. And you can feel into the future too. Like, what are you going to do? You have a task you're going to do. And I imagine myself doing the task in sort of preparation to do the task. So it's a much broader sort of spectrum of how do we feel into life, in a sense, into others and into ourselves. Totally. Yeah.
And it connects maybe with what I said in the beginning with the first person perspective I, because Stein is also writing that it's the present I feeling itself into the past I, into the future I, and the fantasized I. So she's also using this first-person perspective I to describe this human phenomenon. I'm not talking about a self, but I don't want to criticize any other name. You can just choose it. Back then, like really, it's quite a few years ago. As I said, I didn't even find something in traditional psychological research. But that's why I point to traditional psychological research, because if you dive deeper into the clinical literature, you find something about self-empathy, just as you said, right? But the thing is with the literature on self-empathy, that the literature you find, and you really have to search, is not the primary focus of the work. So I did a lot of literature research, round and round and round of literature research, but you can't do a systematic research because the books or the articles aren't described with self-empathy back then, at least. And not a lot of work was described like this. So you don't find it right away. You have to read the text. For example, you named Carl Rogers. If you see the article of Carl Rogers in 1975, you find him writing about the skill of a person to empathize with their own feelings, with their own experiences. But it's not the headline of the article. So you have to really read all the lines and find some cues about self-empathy, or now what I name empathy.
Yeah, so Rogers, he talked about empathy for others. So it was a therapist listening to others and sensing into their experiences. Yes. And so he just sort of hints at, well, when you listen to someone else, it gives them space to feel into themselves. So he didn't really give a name to it, like self-empathy or empathy. Yes. But you sort of have the phenomenon, right? The experience of it is sort of hinted at.
I think who did great work and talked about self-empathy is Judith Jordan, and she's famous for relational cultural therapy and the theory, and great work on that. And as you said, like Carl Rogers didn't name it self-empathy, and you can find a lot of terminology about what I call empathy, like an intrapsychic empathizer or whatever people may have called it. It's just like maybe what I try to contribute is developing clarity about the terminology and the conceptualization, and bridging clinical insights that probably, I say probably, the capacity to feel yourself into yourself is very important for psychotherapeutic outcomes and for mental health in general. So that traditional psychological research didn't do any research so far on this phenomenon. So what I tried, and maybe I represented as a person myself doing research and being a clinical psychologist, maybe that's just the nature of my work in the end, like bridging clinical psychology with the traditional research in psychology.
Well, I think that's important. I think that was one of the strengths of Rogers, is he had the experience. He had, deep experience of being a clinician and sort of the scientific, research aspect. And I think that gives you a broader spectrum of insights into the nature of what you're exploring.
Yeah, he's been a pioneer opening the field of empathy for sure. Yes.
And then, two other people I think that were in this, Marshall Rosenberg, who is also a student of Rogers. So he created nonviolent communication, which is pretty much based on empathy. It's the core of empathy. Yes. It's how do you sense into, someone else's experience, but he also used the word self-empathy. So name your feelings and then follow those feelings to deeper feelings, or what he calls needs. So I think he sort of, he explicitly used the word self-empathy multiple times, I've seen.
Yes.
Yeah. And then there's also Gene Gendlin. Have you looked at his work much?
Exactly.
So in fact, I see the whole focusing process as a tool set for self-empathy, or I guess what you would say. I don't know what you think about that. So.
Of course, I think a major differentiation, which is probably good to follow, is that traditional psychological research has a different view on empathy, and probably as well on empathy, as most clinical researchers have. So probably what you can say is that in clinical psychological research, the term of empathy and self-empathy is broader. Traditional psychological research is always trying to find pieces of the puzzle,
Mm-hmm.
and then understanding the broader picture. And I think that's a difference. However, as being a clinical psychologist myself, I tried to, as I said, bridge both areas. And I think you can also see this in my article, because I named Carl Rogers, I named Judith Jordan, and I've also read the work about Gendlin. Yes, of course.
Yeah. So you're sort of hinting too at the benefits. So I mean, as a clinician, you're trying to support the well-being of your clients. So you have that sense of, well, is this practical? Does this work? Does this help?
Yes.
So you'd laid out some what you were calling the benefits of empathy. Do you want to review some of those? For example, I think you had here, improve their well-being by empowering themselves to build self-efficacious and growth-promoting relationship with themselves and their experiences. So that was one of the comments I read.
It is one of the comments, yes. Well, first of all, what's interesting maybe when we talk about empathy is that a lot of people, like my first observation years ago when I was an intern at the clinic, is that a lot of people have difficulties experiencing their own feelings, bodily sensations, and understanding them. That's what is also called the alexithymia. And so one big benefit of developing empathy is that people get skilled in sharing in and understanding their own experiences, which then can be a referent for their actions, for their behavior. So if you are facing any difficulties or situations, you're rather authentic in the way you're going to behave if you understand your own emotions and if you understand what's probably suitable for you. So this is one thing, but what a really interesting aspect about empathy is what I just said. It's about the capacity of mental time traveling. So a lot of clinical psychologists also hint to that, or well, not that many, but a few, as for example, Judith Jordan, that if you've struggled in the past, let's say you've experienced a traumatic situation, you can still go back with your present eye and visit your past eye with an empathic stance. And this connection, this encounter has healing potential, because what might have not been integrated back then because it was too threatening may be possible to integrate now with more experience after that, with maybe a secure situation, maybe a therapeutic, empathic atmosphere. And out of this situation, out of this security, you might still be able to integrate what maybe hasn't been possible to integrate in the past. So you have a lot of possibilities in the present moment, but you also have possibilities with working with people who have experienced trauma, for example.
Yeah, so if they had trauma in the past, they can sort of revisit that experience of trauma and bring sort of the knowledge that they have from the present and new insights to that to sort of work it out. And then if you have a therapist, you've got that therapist's presence or someone else's presence there with you as sort of to accompany you on that sort of exploration to sort of work out maybe find solutions to those problems that are unresolved.
Exactly. Let's say you can visit yourself in the past, and maybe it hasn't been for good reasons, not possible before, but now there comes a time and you've maybe have been prepared through therapy, or just the time is right. You are able to revisit, for example, your past eye within a situation, and what has maybe been disconnected is now possible to get integrated. So what's going to happen is that actually you have the possibility to develop your personality structure. And with the process of more and more understanding yourself, and maybe also understanding that in that past situation, let's still stay with the past situation, you had no other possibility of behavior. because the situation was so overwhelming, maybe, or you just had no possibility to act within that situation in another way. And with that deeper understanding, and empathy is, let's say, it's a great possibility to get into a deeper understanding with yourself. And this understanding may have a healing effect that you know you had no other chance back then to behave any different. But now you can go back and visit that past I. And then we come to an interesting point. And with this understanding, what can be elicited is compassion for yourself. And empathy and self-compassion may lead to an integrating process of these maybe disrupted feelings or disconnected parts of yourself. And this has a great healing possibility. And another really important aspect when we talk about empathy is that a lot of people are really self-critical. So a lot of people are devaluing themselves when they talk about themselves with inner speech or even aloud. And empathy might be a process, a way of relating to yourself, which may be a counterpart to that self-critical voice. And maybe with an example of psychological research, you probably know Christine Neff, the researcher on self-compassion.
Yeah, I've interviewed her a couple of times.
Perfect. That's interesting. It's great. And she made she did a great study on self-compassion with the two-chair technique, like having these two chairs, and a person can encounter themselves, a part of themselves. And she did that with the self-critical voice. And if you go back into the theory of the two-chair technique, you can read that actually this method is used to foster empathy with yourself. So what Christine Neff did, she tried to invite the participants to feel themselves into themselves, to develop a greater understanding of themselves, and to reduce the self-critical voices, develop empathy, an empathic inner stance, and then with that elicit self-compassion. So I think this is an important task probably for every age of people, to see that a lot of people have really harsh way of relating to their own experiences and to themselves, and to offer skills, to offer methods to develop an empathic inner voice, an empathic way of relating to yourselves, and bring up the possibility to experience self-compassion.
Yeah, that's what I call, for the definition of empathy, I say it's a way of being, sort of taking it out of just one person listening to another, but it's really a way of being, and also the relational way of being. Like, what's the way of being we have as a relationship? In that sense of going back to your past self,
yes.
Are you calling that empathy? That so there's the empathy is in the present, it's in the past, and it's in the future. So all of those experiences is what you're calling empathy, sensing into yourself.
I would say so, because you always experience in the now. You're always rooted in the here and now. So from the here and now, you can travel to the past, you can travel to the future, and within your fantasy. However, you're always experiencing in the here and now. But you can travel and be empathic with all those different eyes. You have a lot of potential. I think there's a vast empathic potential of relating to yourself and to your experiences, and also to your possibilities.
Yeah, so in terms of the empathy work that I do, what I've sort of really focused on is what I call the empathy circle as a practice. Yes. So I don't know if you've seen that on my website, but it's having small groups, maybe 4 people ideally, and we do mutual empathic listening. So if there was 4 of us here, you're speaking, and I would reflect back what you're saying until you feel heard. And then we have a time limit, and then it's, or you feel heard, then it would be my turn to speak, and I select someone to speak to, and they reflect back. So we're doing that active listening within small groups. There's a relation, we're focusing on the relationship. it's not just the therapist doing all the listening, right, to the client, but it's sort of that mutuality. And in one of our circles, we were talking about creativity, and one of the participants say, "Oh, I hate creativity because I have a creative idea, then I judge it." You know, it's that criticism you're talking about. I judge it and then I feel pain. So I don't want creativity because I don't want the pain that comes out of it. And so what we did is we did role play. Like I played her judgment, somebody else played her creativity, somebody else her pain. And we had a mutually empathic dialogue about those, you know, for like an hour. So all those different parts are sort of dialoguing and sort of working through, and they're also empathizing with each other. So her judgment is empathizing with her creativity, and the creativity is empathizing with the pain is empathizing with the other part. So you get all the parts sort of creating that space where the parts don't criticize each other, they listen to each other first. So I don't know, that's another process I think that's very powerful.
It's wonderfully described, and I think at that point, what is it you're describing? Is it empathy or is it empathy? So you've been using sort of the parts of a person, and that's exactly the I-me thing I've been describing at the beginning. However, I think what's important also to add is I don't think of, for example, such a part as an object per se. But you can also, like Buber, maybe, you know, probably Martin Buber, who said, I though. And I think you can also have this experience with yourself. You can objectify yourself, That's probably the self-critical voice, which uses that and devaluing yourself. But you can also have a sort of I though, I would call it I experience, where you are valuing yourself and you're accepting the experience as it is, and you encounter with openness. So, and you're also talking about something really important, because what I've been also writing in my paper is that you have these implicit ways of fostering empathy. And this is an empathic atmosphere. It's what you were just describing, that you're listening empathically to the pain of someone or the criticizing voice of someone. And by doing that, you open up a space for that part or that person to also let empathy come in, to empathize with that part, to empathize with your own experience, which maybe has not been possible before. But because another person or one part takes that role, is empathizing with you, and there's a possibility rising that you yourself may be able and allow yourself to empathize with yourself.
Yeah,
so that's the circle you've been describing, this mutual empathy. It's a wonderful example of empathy and empathy in the interplay with each other.
Yeah, so it's almost like we have internal ways of how we deal with our life, right? How do we navigate the feelings within ourselves, and can we do it in an empathic way, or do we have judgment and judge ourselves or avoidance? I guess those are the blocks, you know, judgment, avoidance, objectification would be some of the other sort of blocks to that empathic way of being. I don't know if there's others that you can think of.
Exactly, and you've been just describing what happens when pain or suffering is held in an empathic atmosphere. And now imagine if this, let's say, empathic atmosphere is within yourself, and you hold your own suffering, your own pain in an atmosphere, in an inner context of empathy. Then change can take place, and then what you may call healing or healing experiences can take place, and you can integrate what you may have been avoiding before within your own self-concept. And then your self-concept can change. And if we again go to Carl Rogers, people in general try to not be dissonant with their self-concept. So if you have the possibility to change your self-concept, for example, through an inner atmosphere of empathy, also your behavior will change. So you become your own empathic companion in your life. Yes.
Yeah, great. So let's see. With the benefits, I had some of the problems. You'd mentioned pains or trauma. So you had a list of other problems was eating disorders, dissociative identity, moral injury, and more. And you have references to all these different problems, self-criticism and forgiveness, self-injury, trauma. So these were sort of the problems that you can sort of work through with empathy, with sort of this empathic more way of being or empathy.
Exactly. So as I said, I did a lot of research and literature research to find any traditional research also on the case of empathy. And what I found were a few studies which you can refer to on the effect of empathy and theories about how empathy can affect your mental health and can affect the process of psychotherapy. And what has been described is what we're just talking about, that there are implicit ways that you can foster empathy, like experiencing empathy through the therapist or like within your circle that you've been describing. You don't necessarily need a therapist for that. It would be a bad thing if we wouldn't have empathy like that in the world with friends and partners and family. I hope a lot of people can experience that joy. So what has been all of these, many of these examples you've been just saying, like dissociative identity disorder, trauma, they hint to what we're just discussing, like that parts of you have struggled in really heavy ways. And maybe it has been hard at that moment when it, for example, a really overwhelming situation has happened, a traumatic situation has happened. It was maybe not possible to be empathic with yourself back then because maybe it was too threatening. And then empathy can have a healing effect if you can open yourself, realize that possibility of then integrating what not has been integrated before. So all these examples actually, how can you say, are connected to what we've been just discussing. And it's if someone is interested, just look up those references. There are a few studies you can find on the effect of empathy. Yes.
Yeah, I think
but
another
still,
big
there's
one.
a lot to do.
Yeah,
it's just the beginning.
It's a great topic. Yeah, it's the other one is fear. I think we go through life, and there's something that we were afraid of, and we just didn't have the tools for how to work through that fear. Maybe that fear sort of stays in us. Like I was really always afraid of public speaking, right?
Yes.
So I got that fear in me. And if you can sort of face the fear, feel into it, so to let it through, and then then kind of transform it with empathy, then you're left with a feeling of connection and warmth and this empathic way of being versus kind of holding that fear. It seems.
Exactly. It's not replacing, like you're describing it. It's not, you don't want to replace anything. It's a way of relating. As you've been saying, it's a way of being. I would say it's a way of connecting, having a connection. And with, you have the fear, but you also have empathy. And with that connection, of course, change happens because the fear doesn't stand alone. You're not overwhelmed with that fear, but you have the possibility to relate to that fear with empathy and also gain a deeper understanding of your fear. If you now share in and understand why you're fearing that situation and you develop a greater understanding of yourself, then you will probably be able to also act differently because you have gained a deeper understanding, and you probably then can rather accept why you're having that fear, and already then probably the fear may loosen up a bit. Yes.
And you'd go forward with that feeling too, right? You go forward with that capacity to maybe meet these other challenges with less fear, or actually
Yes.
meet the challenges with empathy. So, in a situation where maybe I didn't know how to empathize, in the past, and I was fearful, and then I hold that fear. But then if I sort of transform it or feel into it and move through it, then in the future I can have more of that groundedness and that sort of empathic presence for the future challenges too.
Yes. Yes, you've been developing a skill, and there you can see that probably what we're talking about is a capacity which can be developed. And this, of course, is really, really of great interest for clinical psychology, because if you have empathy as a capacity, you can invite people to gain a deeper understanding of empathy and to get skillful in that way of relating to yourself. And I think it's also in psychotherapy, you would probably never get the advice to fight against fear, because that's a battle you're probably going to lose. What's happening if you hopefully not to try it, but if you fight against fear, what happens is probably it gets stronger, and it's going to be even more distressing for yourself. Yes.
Yeah, all this in the culture, this anti-racism, anti-hate, anti-everything. I think it's the wrong way to go. Is that I've done interviews with people. I say it's empathizing with racism, because when you empathize with these fears, these issues, that you transform them, and you actually kind of move through them. So I think that's the same. That's the.
Yeah. Maybe you can say that empathy is an invitation for yourself into an inner dialogue.
Yeah, inner dialogue. So so you did kind of have the list here is existing research. So you mentioned you have a whole list of different people who have sort of hinted at empathy. Snyder describes the human phenomena of introversive empathy using the metaphor of internal empathizers. So that was one person. You had Schaefer adopts the term intrapsychic empathy. And then you mentioned Jordan, who is about relational empathy, and I think has gone into kind of self-empathy. And then Kohut, an attitude of expanded self-empathy, and some others too. So I don't know if any of the other researchers on that, do you want to sort of expound on?
Well, actually, what I try to show is that you have quite different, various terminology. And if you have different terms for a phenomenon, it's really hard to develop a discourse on it. So if you have different concepts, it's hard to exchange insights. It's hard to develop research on something. And that's because obviously I created a new term. You also have to say why you're doing that. And I'm trying to, on the one hand, integrate insights from empathy, but also why it might be useful as a construct to do research on, because clinical research shows that it is a necessary and or let's say a useful therapeutic concept. But you have all these different terms and you don't have a conceptualization. What I found, but actually not to read because I wasn't able to access it, that there's a woman called Clark, and she wrote a thesis on self-empathy. She did an operationalization on it, but I didn't read it, so I can't say anything about it. But no other researcher can be found, I think, to my best knowledge, that translated the construct of empathizing with yourself, the clinical construct, which those researchers refer to, into a conceptualization on which you can do research to, and then develop a discourse about that human phenomenon and develop insights and build a vaster body of understanding. So that's why I try to, on the one hand, say that, oh, I realized I wasn't the only one with that observation. And probably it's with every observation in this world that we're not alone with that. But others as well made that observation. and they have really, really interesting thoughts on that. However, we need conceptualization to build on, of course, to discuss it. I'm not the one that has the wisdom and say that that's the right conceptualization. It's a starting point. I tried to develop a starting point on which we can do research on, and on which we can build on clinical interventions, so that we are also gaining more and more insights and develop our practice in psychology using empathy. Because in the end, you can say what we're doing all the time in therapy is asking people to feel themselves into themselves and to relate in a more empathic way to their own experiences. We could say that this is one main goal of empathizing with people and to do therapy with each other. So I tried to, on the one hand, value the researchers, or some of the researchers who've been describing this human phenomenon of feeling oneself into oneself, and at the same time addressing that we need a starting point to which we can refer if we want to develop this research area.
Yeah, it's a bit of a Tower of Babel, the empathy field is. And, you know,
Yes.
there's a paper by Dan Batson where he lays out like 8 ways that the word empathy is
Exactly.
used. And he kind of threw his hands up. He said, all you can do is define the term the way you see it, be clear, which is what you're doing. You're laying out the description, the definition, and stick to it. I don't think he could find a solution. His was more like, let's create a map of all the different ways people are using the term. And, when you use it, have your term and just be clear about that. So,
yes.
Yeah.
It is a complex phenomenon. It is.
Yeah.
So you can see that in empathy research, there's so many definitions. At the same time, there are really intriguing developments in the last decades, I would say, also with social neuroscience opening a new approach to discovering empathy. And still, and maybe that's also the magic of being human, that you just can't grasp everything. You can try to grasp it deeper and deeper, but still there's some sense that can only be felt maybe, and which is individual.
Yeah, I can always go deeper, that's for sure, into these explorations, which is fun. I enjoy it.
As long as you come back.
Yeah, come back to the broader picture. Yeah. So let's see what there was. So that was sort of the background of the different research. You mentioned Clark, who I think referenced Judith Jordan. I think she probably sort of based her definition. I think Clark, she did, I read her paper too.
Oh, got it. Okay.
And it's she's relating self-empathy to relational empathy. So Judith Jordan's talking about the relational empathy, right? And I think it's a great term, and the definition, the way of being. If you just see empathy from an individualistic point of view, it looks different than if you see it from a mutual relational empathy. And that's what I try to focus on, is the mutuality of it. And within that context, she put self-empathy and relational empathy, sort of a broader, bigger picture.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the interesting thing maybe with this is sometimes people ask me, but do you realize that empathy and empathy might be confused if you speak these terms aloud? Maybe you can't right away understand if you're talking about empathy or if you're talking about empathy. And my answer in general is, well, maybe that's not a bad thing. Because in the end, we're already, if you go back to Einfühlung, it started as Einfühlung. And if you trace back compassion also originates rather with in Buddhistic roots, and compassion encompasses the other and yourself and all beings. And so maybe it's not that bad that sometimes you might not hear right away if it's empathy or if it's empathy. It's always relational, and it's always yourself who is experiencing. So whether it's empathy or empathy, you're experiencing foreign consciousness or your own consciousness through yourself. So there are a lot of probably, let's say, similar processing patterns of both capacities.
Well, it could be empathy, right? In a sense, right? Instead of empathy, it could be empathy, or something. It would be a clearer distinction. I don't know.
Maybe.
Yeah.
Why
Okay.
not?
Well,
The
yeah,
field is
why not?
open.
I still like self-empathy, because I'm still
Well, why
in a
not? Why not?
self-empathy course,
Yes.
but I mean, it totally overlaps with what you're talking about. So I love this exploration. So that's that's just setting the foundation here, and then you go into the structure of empathy. So you got 4 different terms, aspects of it. So you have, let's see, so you have 4 interdependent dimensions of empathy, and it's internal attention, metaposition, accepting, attitude, and understanding. And then I think you're adding sort of a 5th of what's your reaction to that experience. I don't know if you want to go through maybe some of those aspects.
Yeah, as you just been talking about Bateson, and I already said that my research is based on insights of empathy research. And although there may not be a consensus on one definition on empathy, you can find more and more consensus about aspects of the psychological processing of empathy. So empathy, like empathy, is a construct that is probably too complex to just describe with one factor. And what I just said, like what I tried to contribute with my PhD and also with this paper, is to bridge between what we've already been mentioning in clinical psychology, that there is a human capacity for empathizing, into traditional psychological research, which needs an operationalization. And that means it needs a conceptualization on which we can build assessment instruments to do research on. And then you need those components to do the research on. And the components of empathy, based on empathy research, but also, I'd say, a rather complex operationalization process, which I'm describing in my dissertation, are those 4 aspects you've just been mentioning. It's perceiving, it's the metapossession, it's the accepting attitude, and it's understanding. And what you can also see with these 4 dimensions, that is a multidimensional construct, which, in my opinion, but it's only my opinion, just decide for yourself, encompasses affect and cognition. And that's the part of sharing in. It's the affect, it's resonating with your own experiences, but it's also the cognitive part of understanding. And to do so, first of all, if you want to share in, you need to at least direct a minimal amount of attention to your own experiences, so that you're able to perceive. So you can perceive your own experiences. So it's as you can see, it's a process I'm describing. You're trying to perceive your own inner states. And so what's interesting now about empathy and also about empathy is that when you perceive yourself, it is important to not fuse with your internal states. That's what you may have been talking about, the fear. If the fear overwhelms you, then you are the fear. You can't think clearly. Your options of behavior are really, really small at that moment. So what is important is that you have metacognitive capacity to regulate the inner closeness, but also distance to your internal states, because what you want is open up the space for relation. As we've been saying, it's a way of relating to your own experiences. So again, the I and the me makes sense with that. If there's an I that can perceive the me, let's say a feeling of fear, then you have an inner space in which a relation can be built. But to do that, you have to have regulatory capacities to be able to open up that inner space. Now, as you've been already saying, people sometimes avoid their feelings. So with empathy, as with empathy, you do not want to avoid your feelings. Also, when you say like Rogers, entering the internal frame of another person as if it was your own, and with openness and curiosity. If you're not open to the experience of another or yourself, you're probably not going to experience all of it, because you're already maybe avoiding some of the experiences. You can't get the greater picture. I'm sorry, I'm doing it because I've been sick lately, so excuse me for that. It happens from time to time. So you have the perceiving. For the perceiving, so that you don't fuse with yourself, so you can discriminate the I and the me, you need this meta position, regulatory processes. You need an accepting attitude, so that you don't avoid any sorts of experiences. And within that process, you gain an understanding. So these are the 4 components of empathy I'm describing. And with that process of sharing in and understanding yourself, you build a referent for your behavior. And so you could say that a process might be, still, it's all hypothetical, that while you're with empathizing and gaining a deeper understanding of yourself, building a referent for your behavior, you may have the potential to elicit self-compassion and self-referential behavior in helping yourself. This might be the process. And these 4 components interact. That's why I said these are interdependent. Yes. And these 4 components, these sub-psychological processes, you can then again assess and see if a person has the capacity to feel themselves into themselves in the understanding of that conceptualization.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so you have a model that this is your model. And if I'm understanding it, the model is sort of that I, and then there's the experience. You have different feelings and you're sensing into, if it being fear or pain or whatever, that you're able to, you have that space to sense into and sort of work, set into that. And then that gives you that, I guess that's the meta position, is that you have that I, and that you sense into and you sort of work through, and you get sort of an understanding of those different feelings or experiences and the nature of those. Is that sort of
maybe in simultaneous, you don't lose yourself while empathizing. You still, well, one important thing when we talk about empathy, I just called Carl Rogers again. He said, as if I were the other. And this is the self-other discrimination, which is a very important aspect of whether we are talking about empathy or about identification. And the same is about yourself. If your identification with, for example, fear is really, really high, if you're merging, then you don't have the possibility to relate, to think broader, to act broader, and to empathize. So as with empathy, the self-other discrimination, you could say the discrimination between I and me, the contrast has to be big enough so that you're still able to relate to yourself. Otherwise, you're merging, you're probably going to be highly identified with one feeling. And what happens if people are, for example, highly identified with their suffering, they might develop self-pity instead of self-compassion, because they're confusing themselves with single experiences, and they are not able to grasp a bigger picture and to get more distance to a feeling and talk about it or sense it.
Yeah, here's something that comes up is the identification. I identify with the empathy. So do you know what I'm saying? That I see myself as a sort of a being that senses into the world or into my experience. So there's sort of an identification with the feeling into quality and the reflective aspect. Because like as a therapist, with Rogerian person-centered approach, he didn't give advice, he didn't ask questions, he just he did empathic reflection to reflect back his understanding of where the person was, and through that reflection, they sense deeper and deeper into, the areas of their life that they sort of want to explore. So that I and the feelings you have, that you sense into, but you sense into by reflecting, by saying, oh, I'm sensing some fear. I hear, is that accurate? So what I'm saying, there's an inner dialogue that sort of takes place, and can you have an inner reflective dialogue with what you're experiencing? That dialogue of sensing into.
Maybe I'd be talking about resonating, so that you also have the affect. Reflecting would be rather cognitive in my understanding.
Okay.
And with Rutsch, I think also in the article I mentioned before, in 1975, I think it's probably his last sentence, if I remember right. He was writing that probably the greatest gift you can give to another person is a deep understanding. And I think this you can also turn around to yourself. If you're getting into a deep understanding with yourself, with your joy as well as with your suffering, then you can give yourself one of the greatest gifts. And what I'm just also maybe an interesting aspect is that often when we talk about empathy, or when we think of empathy, we're probably talking about pain or suffering. But interestingly, it's a capacity, again, that's because I like this description so much, feeling into, and you can as well feel yourself into your joy, your if you're proud of something, your happiness, but as well your anxiety, your fear, your sadness. It's the whole range of emotions you can feel yourself into. So also the reaction on that, like we've been talking, maybe when it's concerned about pain or suffering, a reaction might be on your deeper understanding, self-compassion and self-helping behavior. If you're experiencing happiness, your reaction will probably be different. Yes. So that's also maybe important, that it's first of all a capacity to feel yourself into yourself, or to feel yourself into somebody else, and through that build a connection and gain a deeper understanding.
Yeah, that's why I like the term empathy versus compassion, because compassion is sort of focused on just pain or suffering, whereas exactly. What you're saying there is the empathy is the full spectrum. It's like, and I'm not the Buddhist is like, all of life is suffering. Sounds like sort of a depressing worldview. It's like, I have a lot of fun in life, right? There's a lot of joy, there's a lot of pleasure, there's a lot of exploration and curiosity. So I just find that empathy sort of is how we connect with that full spectrum of human experience. And so that's why I'm kind of more interested in empathy versus compassion or self-compassion per se.
I think the process is really interesting, and like maybe when I first came up with that idea, I was researching on self-compassion, right, and on empathy. And what struck me the most is, like, if self-compassion is so valuable for mental health, and that's what research on self-compassion is showing so far, then it is of such great interest. How can you elicit self-compassion? And if empathy is one piece of the process that can help to foster self-compassion, or like empathy is of such huge importance to build compassion, which again has potentially great effects on your mental health, then it's interesting to do research on that and to try to find out how we can help people to be able to empathize, to be empathic with themselves, and to then maybe build compassion for themselves as well.
So you were seeing empathy as sort of a gateway to compassion and self-compassion. See, that's why it's important. Hey, if you're interested in compassion or self-compassion, you really need to have a deep understanding of the nature of empathy. Then it's kind of what I'm hearing there.
I think so, that it's maybe it's not always the must-have, but I think it's I think it's one door opener for compassion and empathy, and for self-compassion, empathy. And that's why I've been also mentioning the study of Neff with the 2-chair technique, because I think it builds on the idea that if you feel yourself into yourself, if you gain a deeper understanding, then self-compassion can easier arise than if you don't have that understanding. If you look deeper, and that's what many, I think, therapeutic disciplines are trying to do and to support, to gain a deeper understanding in your own nature. And also, for example, again, in past situations, to like Gilbert, if you know, probably you know the researcher Gilbert, who's also writing
Interviewed
about
him a couple times too.
Well, it's so great. You know, everybody. I'm jealous. And he's writing about forgiveness. And then again, we're talking about the past. And he says that to be able to forgive, it's important that you're able to empathize with yourself, because it's not easy to forgive if you don't get a deeper understanding about why, for example, it wasn't possible to act differently in the past, because these were the possibilities you had. Now it's a different time, you have different possibilities, but back then in that situation, that was possible. And with all those restrictions you had back then and the experiences you had at that time and the competencies you had at that time, and then if you gain a deeper understanding and if you are able to accept it and empathize or empathize, then forgiveness can arise.
Yeah, so that's the process of sensing into and seeing the context that the action took place. And then with that, you can, it's the same thing with conflict mediation, right? Parties they hate each other, but when they really hear each other, they start understanding the context of why the person did what they did. And then with that understanding, it's like they let go of the fear or the animosity or the pain.
Yes.
Yeah,
Yes.
or have that maybe that forgiveness. Sometimes you don't even need to forgive people. It's just that understanding of the context kind of resolves the constriction or the conflict.
Yes. And when we talk about empathy as well as about empathy, they are contextual constructs, phenomena. Maybe you can talk about a personality trait when you talk about empathy and empathy, but still there are situational aspects. So when talking about empathy and, for example, past situations, but also present situations or any other experience you're talking about, I prefer talking about an internal context and an external context. Both are important. It's not only the situation it's surrounding yourself, but it's also the internal context that has to be looked at. And it's always, you can't, I think it's not possible to judge from the outside what in the end is an empathic behavior of somebody, because it's always important to elaborate the internal context of meaning of that situation, as well as the experience of that person of their external context at that time.
Well, something that kind of an experience that comes to mind, maybe I just share this, is I do freestyle dancing, or I used to, and I felt this fear and anxiety within myself, sort of a deep, usually I just go and forget about it. I said, I'm going to try to get closer to it. It's like, I could feel it sort of in the core, just some kind of an anxiety and I said, I want to get as close as I can to it. And it's sort of like a picture. Like if you see a photograph that, has a printed, it's made up of pixels, right? There's little dots. I said, I want to get as close to those pixels as possible to fill my consciousness to go right into that anxiety. So I started sort of moving, dancing, and being sensitive to the felt experience. And then it sort of like grew in my awareness to where it started turning into metaphors, like thousands of little knives, cutting into my chest, into my heart. And as I got closer to it, it's like it sort of melted away by getting closer to it. But then within, 3 or 4 seconds, it seemed like I became aware of another sort of a fear, another anxiety. It was more like a heaviness on my head, and like a fog, kind of constricting my head. And I said, oh, I'm going to feel into that. And so anyway, I spent like an hour kind of searching for these different anxieties and fears and moving into them. And when I could get close enough to them, they would sort of disappear. They'd kind of like melt away, but then it'd be another version, another form, a completely different form. And after about, I don't know, an hour or half of this, at the end, I felt like I felt so calm, so warm, so, relaxed from going through that. So I see that as like a form of empathy, right? I'm sensing into, I didn't have, and trying to get closer to the felt experience that I had. This was kind of going into more fears and anxieties, and sort of moving through those. And I just thought that somehow when you go through them, you sort of release oxytocin or something, you feel a sense of deeper connection, and that creates a sense of warmth and sort of, I don't know, I was almost like bliss. So I don't know why. I just wanted to explain it. We're talking about the inner landscape, and that's one sort of inner landscape experience.
And it's a great and brave thing you've been doing, and getting into touch with yourself and all these experiences. And also in what you've been just describing, I think what's a really interesting approach when we talk about empathy as well as empathy is imagination, is fantasy. And we can use that to gain deeper insight, to find images of things that might be hard to describe. But if you say like thousands of knives, this you get a feeling right away, woof, thousands of knives. This can be taken serious. Yes, you're in danger. That's a really extraordinary situation you're in. So one aspect to foster empathy, I believe, is using creativity, using imagination. And there lies a big and huge potential for changing inner pictures, for changing your narrative about yourself, about your past experience, and also about your possibilities of the future. And I think empathy is one way that can help yourself to change your inner pictures. We could also say change your inner concept, your self-concept, your inner personality structure, with using, empathizing, for example, through creativity, through images. And you can also use this in therapy in a wonderful way.
There's a whole tool set for how do we sense into ourselves. So the imagination is, one tool set, kind of doing role playing, having those metaphors. So I guess there's sort of the question of like, how do we create a tool set and having a vocabulary for, defining what we're talking about. So it's like, how do you have that tool set for doing that empathy or self-empathy? And I think that's what Gene Gendlin with his work with focusing. I think he could have called that, instead of focusing, called it self-empathy, because it's like, how do you stay, or empathy, or we're gonna have we'll have is how do you sense into yourself. And his is like, stay with the felt experience, don't conceptualize, but where's the feelings, describe the feelings, get a reflection from someone else, an empathic reflection, which kind of helps support that presence with the felt experience, and keep with the experience from moment to moment, because just by sharing it, it sort of changes the dynamic, and getting a reflection on that felt experience, it starts taking a different shape, a different form, and it sort of expands or contracts or moves, or some other sort of a feeling sort of arises. So that's just is one methodology, is that whole focusing methodology to sense into the felt experience, your own felt experience.
Yes, and I think it's important. What story are you telling about yourself and about your experiences? And by gaining a deeper understanding through empathy, also your story might change. And speech, or the way you're talking, affects your reality and affects how you're experiencing, what kind of emotions gonna rise up. So it's always very important to look at the way people talk about their experiences, and then offer a way of, for example, a deeper understanding, or by having the word empathy, offer a new terminology and a new way of storytelling about yourself and about your potentials and about your past.
Yeah, so one of the criticisms I hear of empathy is like, oh, it's just talking, right? It's like there's no action, but the action component kind of happens because your sense of self changes, and then it's like your whole life's actions are changing from that. So it's highly action oriented, because every action that you take is going to be influenced by that new sense of yourself.
Yes. And you're talking about an important aspect when we talk about empathy as well as empathy. It has an intention. Like you were saying, you were staying with your experience. You wanted to see the pixels. You wanted to get closer. There's an intention set to approach your experience in a certain way. So both aspects are really, really important. First of all, it's an intentional way of relating in a specific way. It's the how and it's the intention that is set. That is really, really important when we talk about empathy. Empathic situations can come up in really different ways. Maybe you get involved in an accident and then you get hurt, and then empathy may arise because you got hurt. But you can also, for example, let's again take that, maybe do the two-chair technique. It's an intention to meet yourself in a certain way. And then what's really important, and that's the difference to maybe self-criticism or devaluing yourself or judging yourself, is that you set the intention also to relate to yourself and to your experiences in a certain way. And that's the how. And the how is probably one of the most effective things you can talk about when you're talking about mental health, how you relate to yourself, to your contexts, to your life, and also to your potentials.
So if you set the intention I would set is, what I want to develop an empathic way of being as a core. I think that in fact that's, the Center for Building a Culture of Empathy, which is basically saying, the society needs, for just greater well-being, we need to have empathy and you could say empathy as a core foundational value in the society. And so that's sort of my intention, I guess, is that developing that way of being and, articulating it and finding tools and processes and practices and ways of spreading it too.
Yes, I think we're on probably rather close missions when I hear you with that. And my belief is, I totally agree with you that, for example, if you experience a person who is very harsh on somebody, then in most of the cases, this person is probably even harsher with themselves. So what I also believe in is that if we, for example, in therapy, accompany people in finding more peace within themselves, understanding themselves more deeply, being able to accept themselves more and more, and maybe have healing effects with that to get to a more peaceful state of being, then, of course, because we're all members of this world is becoming more and more peaceful. Our interactions will be probably more peaceful.
Yeah, I interviewed Johan Galtung. I don't know if you know him, but he started the Peace and Conflict Studies programs in the universities. He's from Norway. And he has this great quote that is peace is resolving conflicts with empathy, creativity, and nonviolence. It's a never-ending process.
Yes,
and I think that the empathy part of that formula gets sort of left out, that people don't say, hey, it's quite central to peace is the ability to be able to empathize.
Yes.
Yeah. And
Yes, totally agreement.
maybe I'll also share one of my motivations. You're talking about motivations was, my parents come from East Prussia. So they went through World War II, and I just heard all the stories, of, just the war and all the, family members being killed and all that kind of stuff. And for me, one of the intentions of this empathy movement is to head off those kind of wars. We have that in Ukraine now. And that it is this empathy, I think that sort of this empathic way of being that can really transform, the culture and society. I don't know what you think about that.
I totally agree on that. It's in my hope, we are more and more building an empathic being with each other and being with the world we live in. And I believe in that we start with ourselves, and through ourselves we always interact. And so I truly hope that with people like you now get to know you, who try to help to spread empathy, and maybe my little contribution can be trying to help people empathizing with themselves, because we also have a lot of wars within ourselves. So it's internal context and external context, they often share a lot in common. So and I mean, again, this is nothing new as well. It's a different way of approach with empathy and empathy. But if you look into different philosophies or wise people talking about these matters, they're also saying you start with yourself. You find a way of relating and accepting yourself, and this will change the world piece by piece. Yes. But change your inner world.
Yeah, I'm a bit, I have some concerns about this kind of individualistic, it's all about yourself. Because I do see the relational importance that
I'm with you.
that, I mean, there is that self, and that's what empathy you're talking about, is that aspect. But we are in relationship, and that it is, if you received empathy from your parents and family, like they listened to you, they were present with you, they took in your concerns, and they taught you how to listen to other people and have that, it's that relational aspect that sort of helps build that self, that empathy or self-empathy. So I do see I get sometimes concerned about the individualistic view of you have to, it's all with yourself. So because
don't get me wrong with that. I think we're totally social beings and contextual beings, and it's rather like not demanding of others to be empathic, but trying to build an inner atmosphere which allows myself to be empathic as well, and to be able to connect with the world. That is my intention. Because I've in my experience as a therapist as well, is that people often don't feel the connection with themselves. They are not connected to their own experiences, to their feelings. And where do your feelings and experiences come from? Through interaction with your context. So if people, and that's another hypothetical idea, are disconnected from themselves, they are probably also very disconnected from their environments. And if you are not able to feel yourself, it's probably really hard to feel yourself into somebody else. So I think those two go hand in hand. Like everything in my view is interconnected. And what we can try to do is create an atmosphere, an inner context, but also an external context of empathy, whatever you want to name it. Yeah.
Okay, great. So in your paper, you after you went through to see some of those other headings, you had what the blocks were to empathy, avoiding your own feelings and thoughts. You'd mentioned that being critical, devaluing yourself. I don't know if you any other blocks to.
What do you think? Yeah.
I think, it's avoiding is big, sort of detachment. I guess that's
yes.
It's self-judgment, devaluing judgment, I think is is a big part that we sort of, you know, kind of block that. Yeah, so those were, yeah, just some of the blocks that, I mean, there's sort of, yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, I didn't want to
No,
interrupt.
go ahead.
Maybe the avoidance is a really interesting aspect connected with what we've been just talking about, individualistic, social beings, and so on. I think today, or if people are suffering, let's say it like this, but not only in suffering, people disconnect from their experiences. And sometimes, as you were like talking about the knives, maybe not everybody would say, okay, then I approach this feeling and I want to go to the pixels. Probably a lot of people would take their smartphone and avoid the feelings by checking their mails or watching a few videos and not feeling their feelings, avoiding it. And the same thing is with your environment. You might also avoid your environment, and so that you don't feel what your environment may cause with your affect. And the thing is, again, with the acceptance of and the way of relating to your feelings, if you didn't learn, for example, through empathic parents, how to relate to your feelings, which may be caused within yourself or through interaction or whatever the cause may be that a feeling arises, then probably you're pretty much prone to avoid it. And avoidance in the end may cause quite a struggle with your mental health, because avoidance might be smartphone consumption in an excessive way. It might go to alcohol consumption, and it might even go to suicidal ideas. So I would say the other side of avoidance would be the possibility to relate to yourself, to your experiences, to your environment with empathy or with empathy. But this doesn't mean, in my opinion, that you always have to dive deep, but to not force yourself to avoid it or to go deep, but to stay with it, or to consciously decide that you may want to leave this feeling for now, but you just don't avoid it unconsciously.
And have support, so supportive community of people that listen to you and support you, as well as like with the therapy, is that someone who's going to be there present with you, so you're not alone with those maybe those feelings that you have been avoiding.
Exactly.
So let's see, then in your paper you went through the similarities with differences to related constructs. So there's a lot of different constructs. I don't think we'll just pass through that for now, because that's a big topic.
It is, and I think we've been there a bit,
yeah,
with maybe some major constructs like compassion and self-compassion. So
yeah, I'll just read through them. Compassion, compassion for oneself, self-compassion, cognitive diffusion, mindfulness, objective self-awareness, and self-monitoring were some of the concepts that are sort of related, that you kind of go into and explore the relationship to empathy. And then so you had ways, what are ways to promote empathy? So you've got I think that was did you have any more thoughts about that?
Many more. How much time do we have? No.
I have as much time as you want. I can go for.
No, I'm just kidding.
I kind of thrive on this exploration. It feeds me to explore this topic. But I will mention empathy circles. I found it as a first step gateway practice. The empathy circle I found is one of the best first step gateway practices, because it's easy to do.
Yes.
It's like, because usually empathy is seen like in the client therapist model, right? There's one person, you as this individual empathize with others. How well do you do it, and so forth. But with an empathy circle, it sees it from the relational aspect, because you're seeing other people empathizing with each other, listening to each other. You're being the center of the group by sharing, so that supports your self-empathy, because the group is being present with you as you explore, and you're also practicing listening to others. So it seems to have the more of the relational aspects. I just find that is sort of a practice. You know, if empathy is a practice, this is sort of a really good foundational first step, sort of a practice. And so yeah, I've been just trying to promote that as widely as possible, spread the practice.
Great. And I think the what you just been mentioning about the article is exactly maybe this differentiation between their implicit or rather indirect ways to promote empathy. And that, for example, as you've mentioned and we've mentioned before, like the therapist's empathy can open the door to empathize for the patient or the person to be able to also feel empathy with their own experiences. That's rather implicit. So what this aspect of the publication is about is that there are implicit ways, and it has been researchers have been writing mainly about these implicit ways to foster empathy. Now, if it's such an important skill, if we hypothetically say that it is an important human skill, then of course it's interesting to think about how can you do it explicitly. And then we are talking about what we've been maybe saying before about the two-chair technique, about creative ways with trance journeys, with any sorts of therapeutic approaches, and we enter the field of therapeutic innovations, which we can now try to develop to foster empathy, and best way also empathy, but I think they have shared aspects.
Yeah, and so one of the other process, you talk about closeness in interpersonal relationships. So that's having constructive, relationships, families, friends is sort of supportive too.
Models, yes, and learning experiences of how to deal with your own experiences as another person shows that you can relate to your own experiences with empathy. It models that way of relating to your own experiences and opens up that space to allow yourself to value yourself enough that you're worthy to relate to yourself in such a way.
And then you had self-judgment, self-destruction can be let go of. I don't really have any good techniques for letting go of self-judgment.
I think, again, we're coming to that gaining a deeper understanding and also relating to the self-judgment, like you've been describing that circle of relating to self-criticism as a part. Understanding how, if you take the judgment, how did it develop? When was it maybe even necessary in your life to relate to yourself in that way? But maybe it's not necessary anymore. Maybe there's something, a need underneath that way of relating to yourself, maybe to feel a certain way of being secure or protecting yourself, but protecting yourself with a really, really high price. So if you understand deeply through empathizing what the real need beyond that way of relating to yourself is, then you can possibly change your behavior through that deeper understanding and try different strategies of feeling, for example, secure enough in social situations or wherever it might be necessary.
Well, in the empathy circle, we always make a point that you're free to say whatever you want. You can be judgmental. You can, it's like some people say, don't be judgmental, but feel, whatever comes up for you, be able to express that, but it will be met with empathy, right? The person who you're speaking to is just going to reflect back, sense, what you're saying. And I think that just when judgments are heard and sort of reflected, it's almost like they sort of melt away. You see that in conflict mediation. People are judgmental towards each other, but if somebody can just hear them, they express their judgment, and then they feel that they're going to be heard, then that judgment sort of tends to melt away, and people start getting more real. It's from my experience.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I think you had other ones, other topics like loving kindness meditations, individual overall sense of self by Barth. You'd mentioned integrate into the individual. So there's a whole bunch of other ways to promote empathy or empathy
Right.
that you mentioned.
Exactly.
Okay, and future directions. So where do you see yourself going with this research, or where do you think the research should go, or what are you directions you're promoting?
I think the stage is set. All directions are possible. And actually, I mainly hope that a discourse arises, and that's what I'm experiencing also in interactions with other people, or like our contact right now. And to me, we've already made different studies, so there's a lot of to do with that, and so I'll try to implement it within myself, of course, first, but also in my work. And I just hope it inspires other people as well. So if I can make any contribution to a more peaceful world, I'd happily do it. Yes.
What are the studies? Do you have some specific studies you're doing?
Well, we've as the dissertation is called, it's also conceptualization, but also operationalization. So we developed an assessment instrument, and but I think it's too early to talk about these things right now, and there's research to come, but hopefully also of other people. I hope that other peoples are interested in working within that field and developing empathy further. So yeah.
Well, yeah, we're doing a study on the empathy circle practice.
Yes.
So we're
Right.
kind of, maybe we can talk
Great.
about that at some point. So doing some kind of research,
Great.
like what's the role of empathy or self-empathy within like the empathy circle.
Yes.
So yeah, in terms of, I just wondered, just before we end, any more thoughts on NVC, like, Rosenberg's approach of the whole methodology of naming feelings and needs, or the focusing general because they were sort of like came after Rogers. So they were taking, the empathy in kind of these different directions. Any thoughts on those directions?
Yeah, actually, what I would like to ask you, because you've been coming up with Rosenberg, I know that he is talking about empathy and self-empathy. But I don't know enough about him and his work. I didn't dive deep enough to have an opinion, I would say. But what I can hear is that for him as well, those concepts go together, empathy and empathy. So I would rather be interested in your view on that.
Okay. Yeah. So what I saw is that, Rogers was, you listen to other people and you reflect back, that sense of empathy. And he explored that and did his non-directive, counseling, and really, kind of mapped out the territory, I thought just quite brilliantly. And then Rosenberg, he sort of built on that, and his was like, how do you sense into someone else's experiences? You look for the feelings, their felt experience, and then you name the feelings, and every feeling has sort of feelings connected to it. So if someone is feeling fear, and I hear you're feeling fear, that fear is connected to, so he has a philosophical notion that there's needs, that everybody has these set of needs, like, care, love, equality, and that those fears, or any feeling, sort of goes back to this need that people have. So you try to name the feeling, and then you try to look for the underlying need. And then once you have identified the need, you can develop strategies for how do you get that need met. Like if you're in an environment where, hey, I would like some peace and care, but I'm feeling totally afraid because I'm, that if I can name, I would like peace and care, then you can start looking for strategies of
I see. Yes.
And the same thing is yourself. I mean, it's self or other that you can feel into the, and then it's just a philosophical statement that everything is sort of based on needs. So there's, so that's that methodology. So, or that
And I think
approach.
it's highly therapeutic as well. It's like what we've had, maybe this is connected, like when we're talking about self-judgment. And now you could judge the self-judgment, but you might also explore, for example, in therapy or whatever context, what lies behind that self-judging, and exactly what need tries to be fulfilled. For example, criticizing yourself so hard that you're not that you try to not make any mistakes, so that you're feeling safe. So you're coming to that need of feeling safe, being secure, maybe in relationships, whatever context may be. And in my opinion, or in my understanding, therapy always tries to get under those first expressions or first impressions. You're becoming like a person who's highly self-critical. Well, probably for something, it is important to have the strategy for a certain need. But this way of, for example, relating to yourself has a high price, because possibly it causes inner struggles, maybe even causes depression or whatever may arise. Yes.
Yeah, so it's a lot of wasted energy too. It's pain is wasted energy versus getting to that underlying, naming those underlying needs. So, So
And it's really, excuse me.
No, go
Yes.
ahead. Go ahead.
And when self-judging or being self-critical, I think it's really hard to keep up your self-esteem. So
yeah, and so that's Rosenberg, and then from what I see with Gendlin, he did a study. He said, in therapy, there's people in therapy who are moving forward in their growth, right? And then there's a percentage that don't move forward. So he did a study of why are people moving forward? What are the people who are moving forward in their therapeutic growth? What are they doing that's helping them move forward? And his insight was that, he recorded, I don't know, hundreds or whatever of therapeutic sessions. And it was the people who named their felt experience that were sort of at the edge of their consciousness, even whether they're sort of murky feelings, they don't quite know what those feelings are, that they name they're kind of staying present with that vagueness, seeing what sort of arises, and then naming the feelings in sort of real time, and then staying with those feelings as they emerge and develop, and that sort of creates a sense of actual emotional, there's a growth, a forward movement in the person. And so he sort of created a structure for how do you do that, just with others. You have someone that kind of just sits with you and does empathic reflection, but a tool set for how do you tap into those feelings and identify them. And then there's always new feelings, so you give voice to the new feelings as they arrive, and then the feelings relate to each other, and you just reflect, you just share that felt, but more the felt experience of it. So that, so I don't know how familiar you are with that focusing process.
Yes. As I said, I read about Gendlin as well, and he's also actually talking about empathizing with yourself. Yes.
Yeah. So so those are some kind of next steps, future directions. So any final thoughts or comments or questions or anything before we close this great conversation?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me. I really enjoyed our conversation and your thoughts, and I'm impressed of your motivation and your work. And so I think for my part, I had the possibility to talk about the things that are most important to me. First of all, just being able to talk about the capacity of empathy and the possibilities that come with it, in my opinion, and to open up a discourse and maybe having the possibility to be helpful and inspire in any way. So thank you very much for that platform.
Well, great, Stephanie.
You
Thank
have
you so
any,
much for taking
yes.
part. My pleasure. I really enjoyed it, and I hope we can keep, following up and
That would be
keep
great.
kind of exploring this topic, because it's a really,
Yeah.
I think, an important topic
Yes.
to go deeper into, create that tool set and those insights. So, okay, well, great. Then have a good night, evening there. It's pretty late there in Germany.
It is. Thanks for having me,
Okay.
and talk to you soon. Bye.
Okay, bye.